Hi everyone, Vinita here. I have some Q&As for you today, plus I have some things I'd like to show you. Today is March 31st, which means the longest month of March ever is almost over with. I hope that you are all home, staying safe and staying healthy during this crazy time. I don't know about you, but we are almost out of paper towels, and there are no paper towels in the stores right now. So my husband donated a t-shirt to the cause, even though he has no idea he did this, but it was quite generous of him, I think. But I've been using just patches of, like rectangles cut out from his t-shirt instead of paper towels when I'm painting. And when I use one, I toss it aside, and then when I go through all of these, I can throw them in the wash with all the other towels that I've been using right now to keep things clean. And it works really well. I will mention though that I did cut off all of the seams so that I didn't get a seam imprint in there. And the reason why I'm using a cotton t-shirt rather than a towel is because there's less texture. So you know how it is when you use those really highly textured paper towels, you can get an imprint. So it would be the same thing with a terry cloth towel. So that's just an idea. If you're running low on paper towels, just find a t-shirt, an old soft t-shirt that you can cut up and use in place of a paper towel. That's something I should have done ages ago, because over time I have gone through a lot of paper towels. Now this is the painting demo that I did last week, I guess it was. This is the finished version, and I wanted to talk with you about a few things in the painting. First of all, here's the reference photo. And when I was trying to decide how to finish it, I thought, maybe it really needs this tree. And so I put in a big dark tree, and it went like all the way up to there. It was about like that wide, just like in the reference photo. And I didn't like it at all. So I took it off, and I used a magic eraser sponge. I also use this little scrub brush thingy that I have. It's kind of like same idea as a toothbrush. It's just a little more stiff. So I used those things to take the paint off. Did it come off perfectly? No. Did it look better before I put the tree in? Yes. But that's the way watercolor goes sometimes. Sometimes you just have to go with it. If you make a big mistake, just try to correct it as best, the best way that you can. So this area is a little bit more murky now than it was, but you know what? That's just how it goes. As far as the rest of the painting, I'm fairly happy with it. I like this passage of color across the barn, and I like the cast shadow there. I have the hint of sheep there. Definitely not defined, but I didn't feel like defining them would really add that much to this painting. So anyway, if you haven't had a chance to watch this demo, it is online in 2 parts. And then I did the final, big tree mistake off camera. I should have filmed it, because you would have agreed with me that, yeah, it really needs to go. But, sometimes you can make big mistakes and then take them away and just go on with the painting. So that is that demo. Like I said, it's online if you haven't watched it yet. And now on to questions. So I had a couple of good questions. And by the way, this is just what would you call it? Just a sample mat. That's why it's not clean or anything. I use this to put paintings in progress in, to see how they're looking. So it's always good to have a sample mat. This is just real inexpensive mat board, and I cut it to fit a 1/4 sheet size. So the first question I had was about lost edges on a portrait. And this is a portrait I did earlier this year. Basically, it's just a study. I did it in a monochrome color, which is a good way to practice anything that you're trying to learn more about, but especially it's a good way to practice lost edges, because you're not thinking so much about color, you're only thinking about value and placement of paint, and then of course the edges. So I just wanted to point out that there are some lost edges here that are not always easy to leave as a lost edge. So this edge right here is just barely defined. It's actually mostly defined by a very light pencil line. There's just a hint of paint there, but it's so slight. So that edge is essentially a lost edge right there. Have another lost edge right up in here, and then right up in here, obviously. And I just wanted to let that blend out. I didn't want to have her whole head be defined. There's some lost edges in her hands out to the outside here. There's lost edges in between fingers in places, lost edges on the, the forehead down to here. There's just nothing there, where in reality there is a little bit more definition in that area. So when you're thinking of applying lost edges to a portrait, you can think about anywhere where the values are similar, you can lose an edge, like that would be an example here, or anywhere where you don't want to have or don't need a lot of definition. So like the top of her head, I didn't need a lot of definition there. So those are two areas where you can really look to see, can I lose an edge where the values are similar or where I don't need a lot of definition. So for instance, right here in her shirt, there's no edge right there, even though this is skin and this is the shirt. That's not important to define that, so I could just leave that more nondescript, where it is more important to define her eye, for instance. So those are some tips. I'm not a pro at doing portrait work, but hopefully that answers your question and gives you some things to think about the next time you're doing a portrait. My next question was on painting a palm tree. I really do not feel qualified to answer this question because I think this might be the second palm tree I've ever painted because I don't spend a lot of time in tropical areas. But really, painting any type of plant, tree, whatever, it's mostly just about observation and learning how the structure is formed and then just trying to duplicate that in paint. So I've got a trunk in here, and then I've got the middle of these palm, what would they be called? Palm fronds? Is that what they're called? But I have the middle section there, and you can see that that provides the structure. So that's what you want to look for when you're starting to paint a palm tree, would be those mid sections. Also notice that the palm tree trunk is not perfectly straight, and I doubt that any of them are. So when you draw them, don't like get out the ruler and just go, give them a little bit of wonkiness. Another thing to notice is that it's hard to see in this photo because it's kind of small, but a palm tree trunk is like a column, and it's usually pretty tall. So when you're looking up, the ridges in the trunk are going to curve up like this. They're not going to be straight across, and they're not going to curve down. They're going to curve up. And you can see that right there, and right there, and right there, because we're looking up at this area. We're not looking face on, and we're not looking down. So making these little ridges are an important aspect of really any tree trunk, like birch tree, even a fir tree. When you're looking up, any kind of ring around that tree is going to be curved up like that. The other thing is that when you're looking at a tree like this, even though it doesn't show a light source here in this photograph, you want to add in a light source. So one part of your column can be shaded and the other part can be lighter, like the light is hitting that. And I did that a little bit here, left some white, but I could come back in a second layer and put in some more darks. Then you want to pay real close attention to this area where things join, because it's somewhat symmetrical, but it's not perfect. So you want to get in those imperfections, and a lot of those imperfections are happening because of your vantage point. Same thing with the curve and the spacing of these guys. You don't want to just have them be perfectly spaced out like this. You know, you want to have some that are overlapping. Like this area here, you have 3 of them that are overlapping, and then you have these 3 that are more independent. So all of those will help you paint this guy. Another observation that I made, like I said, I'm not an expert at painting these, so I kind of had to learn as I was going, but this middle section here is like the color of a banana. So anytime you're painting something that you're not very well familiar with, you can compare it to things that you are familiar with. So I just thought of a banana color as I was trying to mix up the color for those middle sections. So enough talk, I'm going to get to painting here. I'm not going to paint this whole thing. I just want to give you an idea of how you could approach this. There's so many different ways that you could paint it, but my suggestion would be to keep it pretty simple, because most likely if you have a palm tree in a painting, it's more about the land or the sky or the ocean, you know, it's more about that than it is about just the specific tree. I find that it's true of almost any landscape. The tree is an element of the landscape, so you don't have to be incredibly detailed with just one element. So I'm getting just a nice green color mixed up, and what I really want you to take away from this is to look for the mass. You know that all of these are individual little, what would you call those? I don't know, little blades of foliage. I'm showing my inexperience with palm trees. I don't even know what these things are called. But what I want you to do is look for the mass of the shape and paint that as a mass. Not a mess, a mass. So I can take my brush sideways and see I can paint that as a mass. And then I can take the ends and paint those out more individually. And that's going to work a lot better than if you just try to paint each one of these individually. So look for the mass. The same thing as painting a feather. You want to paint in the mass of the feather and then the individual little parts. There I go, struggling with painting and talking at the same time. So hopefully that gives you an idea here. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to paint the whole thing there, but just by careful observation. So this particular one doesn't have anything growing on this side all the way up to there. It actually has stuff growing, but we don't see it. It's going down behind that. So it starts up right about here and goes out. Now, as far as the color, your color is going to depend on what else is in the landscape, and it's going to depend on the lighting as well. You know, typically, I imagine that this tree is going to be in a real warm sunlight, so the color is going to reflect that warmth. This reference photo is taking on kind of an overcast day, so it's not a great reference for establishing color. So for instance, as I'm painting this, I'm thinking that my green that I'm using is probably not warm enough. It probably needs a little more yellow in it. But again, color, it's not just about the local color of an object. It really is dependent on the lighting and then what else you have going on in your painting. So as you paint this, you have to think about the shape of these guys. How far out are they going? This is a very pointy brush, which helps a lot to paint something like this. You don't want to do this with a brush that does not have a real fine point. So there you go. That's kind of fun. Maybe I need to paint more palm trees. Maybe when this is all over, I need to go someplace warm where I can paint them from life. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some tips on painting these guys. Don't get obsessed with it because it's going to be about this beautiful tropical landscape. I'll add in just a bit more dark on the tree trunk, and this also is going to depend a lot on your lighting in your scene, because the tree trunk is basically gray. So if it's cool lighting, it's going to be more gray, more cool. If it's warm lighting, it's actually going to absorb some of that warm light. And that's why there's very seldom a formula that you can follow all of the time. So I'll just go with the gray here. And you can see how just adding that second layer helps establish a highlighted side and a shadow side. And anytime I want to bring a curve across, I need to think of that curving up, because this is a cylinder and I'm looking up at it. Okay, there you go. Like I said, I'm not a pro at painting palm trees, but hopefully that gives you some advice. The other question that I had was about transparent darks. How do you get transparent darks? The easiest way to get transparent darks is to use transparent colors like phthalo green and permanent alizarin crimson. Those are both transparent. Phthalo blue is transparent. But I don't typically use a lot of transparent paint. So my other tip for making transparent darks is to glide it on to the surface of the paper and let it settle on its own. It's something that's very difficult to demonstrate and actually very difficult to explain, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to mix up, I'm going to use raw umber, which is not transparent. I'm going to use ultramarine blue, which is also not really transparent. And I'm going to use permanent alizarin crimson, which is transparent. A little more blue. Now the color of your dark is just going to be dependent on what you need, but this is just going to be a very dark, almost eggplant color. And I'm going to try to demonstrate the difference that I'm talking about. So not gliding it on the paper is probably easier to demonstrate. So if I take the paint and I just basically apply it, okay? There's not enough pooled paint there to let it settle nicely onto the paper. But if I can get that just a little more watery. It's still quite dark. And if I start it and I get just a little bit of paint there, and then as I add the paint, I'm trying to move it across, barely touching the surface of the paper. So this has just a little bit more runniness to it, and that's going to allow it to settle down on top of the paint that you have there. It's a very subtle difference, but that's one thing that I have found that really helps to get a dark in there, that as it's drying, you can still see some of the color below it coming through. And that's how I get away with not using transparent colors when I'm trying to get a dark that still has some interest to it and doesn't just dry totally flat. So there is a difference when you feel the paint gliding across the paper, you're barely making contact with the paper and you're gliding it across. That's going to feel a lot different than when your paint isn't as liquid and you're trying to force the paint onto the paper. There's a difference in the way that those feel. Very subtle, but that's what helps with these. This is a very small area of this painting, but I have this shadow in here that is still allowing the color of the barn underneath to come through, and yet it's a darker value. So guys, great questions, and if you have more questions, just send them my way, because I love to do these Q&As, and I wish you guys all the best. I'll be in touch real soon.